receiving a copy anyway, and screenshots are apparently a security risk. The parliamentary authorities are worried about the security of Zoom meetings. Some of you will have heard about this concept, Zoom bombing, where extremist groups hijack meetings with unacceptable and illegal film and images. In fact, this happened to a Northwest Unison rally when I was addressing it a few weeks ago, and we had to end the meeting immediately, and we had then to report it to the police. So you don't know what's lurking out there, and I'm told that this is the best way of doing things safely. So on advice from parliamentary security, and to minimise the private chat facility and the whole group chat function will also be disabled because it's a security weakness. Again, this is what they do in Parliament. Any follow-up questions can be put in the chat, but they'll only be visible to the administrator. As you know, I've emailed everyone asking for questions from you about the coronavirus pandemic, and I'll take some of those during the meeting, and the meeting's going to last an hour. So having issued all those grim warnings, I hope that I can at least report back on what I and my office have been doing in the last few weeks during the most serious health emergency which has beset the country and indeed the entire world, probably in our lifetimes. Amidst all of this, I want to reflect on the fantastic work which has been going on locally to fight the pandemic. And I also want to highlight the complete and utter failure of the government nationally, which has been, I think, failed to protect the health of the people. And I also think we need to take time to mourn the nearly 38,000 people who've been victims of COVID-19 in the government's official figures in the last couple of months. And also reflect on the Office for National Statistics figures, which put the number of victims at over 62,000 and counting. It's now the case that per head, the UK has the highest death rate in the world. And I think that that is a very sobering thought indeed. Now, I wanted to take a little bit of time now just to go through some of the things that I and my staff have been doing. And I think that you may have got a flavour of some of those from the written reports that I've been sending out. But just to say, one of the paradoxes of the last couple of months have been an increase of over 50% in the work that we're doing, constituency work. And my staff, even though they've been working under conditions that are somewhat different from normal, have been doing 50% plus more work than they normally do during these months of the year. And some of that has been because of the great increase in pressure that we know that our local area in Wirral has been under. Now, I just wanted to give you a flavour of some of that. Since the global pandemic was prepared and declared by the WHO globally, what we've done is move to a completely different way of doing things locally. So something called the Local Resilience Forum, led by the police, actually, has been set up for Merseyside, and it's a similar structure across the rest of the country. This is a structure which is created in the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, and it's in response to emergencies. Also, our local authorities have completely reconstituted themselves in terms of how they normally do things into what they've called cells rather than the normal structures. And I have to say that since all of this has happened, I've been having very, very regular meetings, both with the Resilience Forum for briefings, with the local authority weekly to fortnightly, with the local health authorities as well, with the police and with other organisations to see what's happening and see what we could do to help. In the beginning part of the pandemic, the national government did reach out and say that it wanted local members of parliament to be in touch regularly and report back where things weren't working. We did that with daily calls with ministers to basically report back what was actually happening on the ground and try to get things resolved. That has since actually stopped in quite the form in which it was created initially. Now, when that first happened, some of the biggest issues were about the gap between what the national government was announcing that it was doing and providing and what was actually turning up on the ground. So for example, the health secretary would announce that there were adequate supplies of PPE, that's the protective equipment that care workers and health workers have to wear to protect themselves from the virus itself. And they would announce that they had billions of pounds of this stuff and it was all working well. And then when I would talk to the local CCG, the clinical commissioning groups for the health service, or to the local authority who have responsibilities to ensure that domiciliary care workers, for example, are properly protected, I would discover that actually this wasn't what was happening at all, and that the government were promising supplies of PPE which were to be delivered at a set point, and they just weren't turning up. And when they did finally turn up, often days and days and days late, they wouldn't actually contain in them what had been promised. And so our local authority, Wirral, had got so fed up of this, realising that it was putting people's lives at risk, that they began to try to source their own PPE supplies for their own staff to try to ensure that people's lives weren't being put at risk. And to date, they've spent £1.5 million on 5.5 million different bits of PPE so that they can ensure the safety of local care workers and key workers who've got to go about keeping society going while the pandemic has been raging. Now, they've had to pay for that up front. The government supplies wouldn't have cost anything, but they never arrive. And we've seen with the farrago over the Turkish delivery of PPE and ongoing promises never delivered, what a problem this has been. And to give you another example of this gap between what is announced nationally and what actually happens to be delivered locally, there's this new delivery mechanism which was called Clipper. It was meant to be an Amazon kind of delivery mechanism, the government said, to ensure that the social care sector could have adequate access to protective equipment so that they could keep safe some of the most vulnerable people in our society. It's now 5 weeks late and it still isn't up and running. And so what's been happening is as the virus has actually ravaged care homes up and down the country, this delivery mechanism for vital sources of PPE is simply not turned up. And so local authorities have had to be providing extra support for the social care sector, as indeed have the health service, to ensure that those who are giving care in that setting actually have at least some protection. The height of the pandemic, and it looks from figures locally that the peak of the pandemic was actually the 17th of April in the northwest. At the peak of that pandemic, there were very little supplies at all, and 50 of our 125 care homes on the Wirral were actually closed to admissions because of suspected or actual COVID infections in those premises. When I say suspected, I say that because there was a complete lack of testing available to check whether people who were having suspicious symptoms actually had the disease itself or whether it was something else. And at the height of that pandemic, when the local testing centre opened, you'll know, in Bidston, we realised, thinking that this might be a problem that was finally being solved, people started telling me that the testing centre was empty most of the time. And so I made inquiries to find out what on earth was going on. That test centre has a capacity of about 360 tests a day that can be done through there with the space that there is. And that's what the military achieved when they set it up. And they were only doing 50 a day after the military left. And that was actually because the Deloittes, who were providing the test kits for the local authority run Bidston testing centre, were saying they could only have 50 a day. And on the first day, 25 of those 50 turned up broken. And so even though the local authority was doing things like saying, well, look, we can't have people driving to Manchester, which was what was originally decided they should do if they were showing symptoms. Apparently they should get in a car and drive to Manchester if they had a car. And as we know, not all care workers have cars. Or Haydock, that was the other choice. The local authority said, well, look, we're going to pay for having a facility much more locally so we can get more testing done. And we then discovered that they couldn't get that much more testing done because the capacity to even have the tests wasn't there. And so the CCG, the local health authority commissioning group, also commissioned extra testing capacity. And at the height of the problems that are going on in our nursing homes, the local authority and the health authorities put together could offer 90 tests a day. So with all of those people coming down with COVID-19 symptoms in our social care sector, we could offer less than one test per nursing home on the Wirral per day. And I just don't think that that is my definition, if I would be quoting Matt Hancock, of putting an arm around the social care sector from the beginning. Other things that have demonstrated this lack of connection between what the government announced nationally and what actually happens locally. A month ago, there was an announcement that all vulnerable children would get access to free laptops so that they could continue their studies while the schools are not closed but only being used for key workers. And naturally, some parents of kids were very happy to hear the government announce that. 4 weeks later, not a single one of those laptops has yet turned up. So I think we've got a government that thinks it's a good idea to make big announcements nationally, but doesn't seem capable of delivering them on the ground, and also is pretty incapable of devolving power down so that they can actually just be organised. And I want to really, before I get into some questions that you've sent in, talk about the effect that that lack of support has had on the local authority, because local authorities, both the Metro Authority, the Merseyside area, and the Wirral Local Authority have been spending a lot of money to ensure people's safety in very difficult conditions. So, for example, there have been over 12,000 food parcels distributed to people in Wirral who are in need of support because they're shielding. They've been provided not only by the food bank networks, but also supplemented by the local authority spending on that. Partially because the national capacity to do this was so disorganized, and the kind of food that they delivered was not the best, if I could put it that way. I think Angel Delight and dried beans is a slightly odd thing to think of as a balanced diet. So they've been filling in for that, getting those who are homeless off the streets, so that they can be properly looked after and aren't going to succumb to the disease. Ensuring that extra places in social care are made available for people who are coming out of hospital. Ensuring that, for example, the local authorities can support and give out the grants that the national government announced to local businesses who've been forced to close their doors so that they can try to survive. So all of that has been going on, but there's increasing worries that the extra money that has been spent by the local authority will actually be made available and be reimbursed by the government. But I think that we'll come into that in a minute. So that's a very quick sort of canter around some of the things that are going on. But I would just say that what we've got at the moment is the worst health emergency that we've had in our lifetimes with this global pandemic. And we've also our response to it and what's going on in the world in general mean that we're probably going to have the largest economic depression that we've also had in our lifetimes. The stats make it look like it's going to be worse than the depression in the 1930s. It looks like, for example, the second quarter of this year, so that's April to the end of June, is going to see a 25% fall in gross domestic product. So that's just falling off a cliff in terms of economic activity, which is not surprising. We've already seen a doubling of unemployment in the first quarter of this year, which is really focused very much on the last 2 weeks of that quarter in Wallasey, with unemployment doubling to well over 3,000 now, 7% of the working age population. And there's great hardship coming, which is going to have to be looked after and dealt with by a government that I think is probably one of the least able to do so, both ideologically and with respect to the sort of talents of the people who are in it. So what I'm going to do now is ask, I think there's a question. I'm going to take some questions, and I think Graham Cooper from New Brighton, you sent a question in. I'm going to read it out, give you a quick answer, and then if somebody could unmute Graham, he can ask a follow-up. So Graham, you wrote in and asked this question: as party members, what more can we do to help ensure that the government is held to account for its failings over coronavirus and everything else? Well, it is a very strange time, Graham, at the moment, when we can't campaign and meet in the normal way that we would, and elections have been put off until next year. But I think the important thing that we have to do in all of our dealings with the community, with our own families and with the people we know, is call out the government's failings on this, and its very basic duty to the country. All governments have a basic duty, and that is to protect the health of the people. And I think that it's becoming increasingly clear that this government has been behind the curve, got us into lockdown too late, which has increased the death rate massively, and has been behind the curve ever since in being prepared, in providing the right kind of equipment, in responding properly to the challenges. And I just think we have relentlessly to talk to all the people we know and campaign when we get back round to doing it about these issues, to allow the possibility that we can make the government pay for the inadequate response and the complacency of how they have responded in this, the greatest of crises. So Graham, if somebody could unmute Graham, if the administrator could unmute Graham, it'd be great to listen to a comment and maybe a follow-up question from you, Graham.
Right, thanks, Andrew. I think that's unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, yes.
No, thank you for that. Yeah. No, they're the points that
Can we see Graham as well, please? Can we put him up?
You don't want to see me as well.
Well, if there you are.
Yeah, there we go.
Hi, Graham.
Yeah, the points that were worrying me really, particularly at a time when we've got a government that is just driving roughshod over everything. They won't answer questions from the press. They don't seem to care about what they're doing to the public. My only thought is that this awful situation has touched so many people now that there can't be any people or any families in the country who aren't now aware of what the consequences are. But it's just about how we keep tying that back to the government and show that it's their negligence, their failings that have done it.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's just a matter of how you connect that and show people that's where it's happening.
I think it's a really important point. I do think that there are some questions about Dominic Cummings coming up later, but I do think that the sort of Cummings thing is a very stark example of the rules don't apply. They're only there for the little people kind of attitude that that these Brexiteers and these people that have taken over the Conservative Party, the extremists, let's face it, have towards the public. And I think quite a lot of people have been seeing this in the most stark terms in the last couple of months. Not only the complacency and the sort of insouciance, we had a prime minister that did nothing for 2 months when we knew that this virus had escaped from Wuhan, that delivered blithe messages about how it was all going to be okay and we were the best prepared in the world, whilst actually not doing any preparation as it made its way towards us. A man who actually said that he had gone into a hospital and shaken the hands of coronavirus patients, just as he was meant to be fronting up public health messages, who said before he actually put the lockdown into place that he was sad that he had to take away, and I'm quoting him now, the inalienable right of the freeborn Englishman to go to the pub. Well, if you put it like that, it makes it sound like you still want people to go to the pub because it's an inalienable right of the freeborn Englishman. And obviously the freeborn Englishman sounds like rather a nice thing. So he's been a disastrous message carrier. That's the nicest thing you can say about him. And I just think that we have to ensure that he is made to pay for his negligent approach to all of this. By the way, it's not only the journalists that don't get answers to their questions. We've been struggling in an era of social distancing to try to think how Parliament could actually remain so that it can hold what I think is a very complacent government to account. And the Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, pulled out all the stops in order to create a circumstance where we could have what was known as the hybrid Parliament. It had virtual aspects to it, and it also had people were asked not to go in unless they absolutely had to. So the front benchers usually went in, but other people could contribute if they were chosen. From places like I'm in now, virtually. And although it wasn't perfect, it did work quite well. I mean, I started off being very lucky with what you had to do to get into the virtual parliament was to put in for questions and statements, and then there would be a kind of lottery. And so about 100 people would get on a list out of 650, and out of that, maybe 30 people would get to be called. And I had a very good run in the first 3 weeks and got a Prime Minister's question and various other things, and then nothing for the 3 weeks after. But at least that's better than nothing. Now, what Rees-Mogg has done is abolish the virtual parliament and the way of voting. There was an electronic way of voting. And they abolished that without cross-party agreement when Parliament went into recess at the end of last week. In fact, there was a vote where lots of us basically said that we should not abolish that. And we've all been called back to Parliament on the 2nd. But there's no way of us voting because they've abolished the electronic votes. And they've said that their way of us voting in a socially distanced way, I'll just leave this here for you, was to queue up. We can't use the lobbies, they're too small, and Public Health England have said it's dangerous. So we've got to queue up in each other's slipstreams, 6 foot apart, to walk past the mace so we can vote. And the clerks aren't going to be there because it's too dangerous. They're in a room somewhere else recording it. And so we worked out that that would mean that the queue to vote would go for 1.3 miles. And it would snaking around the Westminster and the corridors. And everyone would have to walk in everyone else's slipstream for large amounts of time. And each vote would take at least 40 minutes. So that's what Rees-Mogg wanted us to do. Public Health England have now said that that's not safe either. So we're faced with going back. So we can do the Parliamentary Boundaries Bill, and we can guess that that won't be very fair,
No.
on Tuesday. And we don't have a way of voting yet. So that's where we are with virtual Parliament. And it's been difficult to hold them to account. But not being able to, saying to people, some MPs are older, or they're shielding, or they live with their elderly parents, saying to them, oh, you can't go. It's just, well, it sums up this government in my view. So anyway,
crazy.
That's where we are with that.
Yeah.
In fact, also the Speaker has publicly denounced the government for not answering questions or letters in a reasonable way. And in fact, they've answered very few of my parliamentary questions. And the letters are now increasingly, which is unprecedented, signed by civil servants.
That's not correct at all.
No, it's not.
It's just wrong. But
this is, of course, a government that illegally prorogued Parliament when it suited them well. And so I think that people are beginning to realise that this is not a government that cares very much about accountability. So I'm going to do another question now. So thanks for that one, Graham. We're going to mute you now, but anyway, thanks for that. I've got a question from Heidi in New Brighton, and many of you will know Heidi, and she's got disabilities, and so we've made sure that she gets this question in. I'm going to read it out first, and I don't know, Heidi, whether you're on, but you might want to be ready to come in with another call. So since lockdown began, many disabled people have been forced to endure extra hardships, which have been exacerbated by this government's lack of empathy and total indifference towards them. I think we can all agree with that. There's been no signer for the hearing impaired on the government's daily broadcast. Blind people have been excluded from the vulnerable group, despite the fact that social distancing is virtually impossible for them, meaning that they've been denied essential online shopping delivery slots. People with certain disabilities have had do not resuscitate put on their health records when they've been admitted to hospital with coronavirus, and getting tested for those with symptoms at home who live alone is going to prove impossible for blind people. In fact, I've just experienced, Heidi says, the latter myself, and had to throw a perfectly good home testing kit in the bin because it was completely inaccessible to me and I live alone. There are only a few examples of the additional difficulties disabled people are currently facing. So my question is, what have you been doing to protect the rights of disabled people in your constituency during this pandemic, and what action have you taken to ensure that they are not forgotten? Well, Heidi, all of those points are extremely good and important, and there are many people who are in a similar situation to you, who've been totally forgotten. For example, when we first heard about the lockdown, the local authority thought that there were only 5,000 people in the Wirral who who were on their shielding list. It was nationally done. In fact, now there are 15,000 because they got all of that wrong. And so there've been people who've been left out of the government's support all the way through this. And you raise extremely good points about social distancing and those who are blind. And I have to say, I think that the government have just forgotten about all of this. When they announced that schools had to reopen, for example, they published huge amounts of guidelines about how that ought to be done, which didn't mention special schools at all. And then again, in a special school, the idea that you could even have any pretense at social distancing is just inaccurate. So I think that the issue on access to testing is even more general than those with disabilities not being able to get access to it. There's been a huge problem getting any access at all, even for key workers in social care. And so what I will do with respect to your particular point is I will write to the CCG. In fact, I'm in touch with them regularly and ask what special arrangements there could be for people who are blind to get tested. So it's quite an invasive test, and it's quite difficult to do it yourself, even if you have sight. And I'm being told there's a very large amount of false results because it's not being done properly when it's self-administered. So Heidi, thanks for the question. Do you want to come back and have your say?
Well, I think I probably put it quite succinctly in the pre-run to my question.
Yes.
Just to say that I've been really concerned about all these issues for some weeks. And just didn't really know what to do. It's been quite distressing actually for myself and to hear of other people in similar situations. And I don't understand why they still haven't got a signer on the daily government's message. But what is that all about? I mean, all the other countries have done it. Why can't we do it?
I think there has been some kind of signer now who seems to stand behind Boris Johnson. I saw it's only happened recently.
Right.
I did see a quite amusing still photograph of the signer with a very big V in the middle of vigorously signing something, which is why I know that they finally put it right. But they had to be prompted, and they were amongst the only people in the world that didn't think about accessibility for people who don't have hearing. So
exactly.
It sums up the entire thing. And on schools opening, for example, I've had meetings with staff, with head teachers, with national union officials and local union officials about what's going on with schools, and there'll be a question about that in a minute. But they've done nothing about the special schools at all. It's like nobody in the Department for Education has thought that, oh, maybe we ought to have give some thought to what's going on in the special schools. And so they're not mentioned. It's absolutely astonishing.
No, it doesn't astonish me, Angela.
No, I don't suppose so. But there you are. We thought that we were making at least some progress on sort of inclusion and ending discrimination. But we know what sort of a person Boris Johnson is and what sort of a government he leads. And I'm afraid he's living down to all our expectations in what is one of the most serious crises, probably the most serious crisis any of us have experienced. So Heidi, thanks for that. I'm going to go on to another one now, and this is, I'm going to read this out because it's from Diane Harris, who's been contacting me regularly. I don't think she's on the call, but this is a question that she asked about the schools going back, and I'm going to quickly read it out and I'll make sure she gets this answer. While watching the briefing tonight, Boris mentioned the secondary schools going back on the 15th of June, which is the first I've heard of it. This is another issue agreed on the hoof without consultation with secondary schools. Is he trying to get that second wave? Is it really herd immunity? Well, if it is, God help us. And she then says, thank you for your report. We need some positive things to help us through this troubled time. I suppose we should be glad we don't live in America. Their death toll is frightening, which is another factual statement from Diane. I looked on Sunday at our confirmed cases. This is locally. And she doesn't believe the figures because not enough people are being tested. The only ones that are suffering from the virus are the ones that are tested. And again, that is an issue. So thanks for all you're trying to do, and how frustrating it must be when you're blocked from doing your job. That's, I guess, how some of the doctors and nurses must feel. Well, Diane asks about the secondary schools going back. The secondary schools have been told that they've got to go back from the 15th. of June. Now, many of you all know that the primary schools are due to start returning from the 2nd. And as I said earlier, I've been having these discussions with both primary school head teachers, staff, the national education unions and the teacher unions, both nationally and locally, about all of this. The announcements were made without consultation, really. There were been general talks between Gavin Williamson and some of the sector about how they might begin to go back. And I think we have to remember that schools haven't ever closed. They've all been continuing to be open, but taking key workers. What had happened there was that people were expecting more children to be at school than actually ended up being at school. But that doesn't mean that teachers haven't been working very hard. In fact, they've been working to stay in touch with the kids that aren't in school, as well as maintain a curriculum for those children of key workers who have been going in. So when these announcements were made, they were made without direct consultation with the sector by Gavin Williamson. And there wasn't agreement on what was safe, how schools should be organised, who should go in, or why, and what would be acceptable in terms of safety. The SAGE, which is the scientific advisory group, people who've been so-called advising the government, had said that they wanted tracking and tracing, testing, tracking and tracing in place before this should happen. And clearly it isn't in place even now, even though Boris Johnson announced that it was going to be launched yesterday, and we know what chaos it's in at the moment. So kids have been sort of told, and parents have been told, that their children, certainly in year 1 and 6 and year 10, and I think in secondary schools, are meant to be going back. But there's been no real proper consultation on what that means, or what's safe, and what the capacity of schools to have kids back in and maintain social distancing is. So I agree with the unions and quite a lot of parents as well, and teachers, that you can't send schools back until it's safe for them to go back, and that's been properly looked at in terms of health and safety, social distancing, these bubbles of kids that are only meant to mix with each other. And there's been no agreement locally or nationally about how that might look. Gavin Williamson spent his whole time saying that they'd done this in Denmark and it was perfectly safe. But in Denmark, they had 600 deaths. They didn't have 38,000 and counting. And they also did ongoing health and safety checks with teachers across schools before they had people back in. And I think that their average class size is 19, not 28. So in terms of talking about Wallasey schools, the primary schools have all got very different issues and problems to deal with, and they seem to be doing their own thing, or at least wanting to. So some of it's about, I think, the type of school that it is, whether they've got multiple entrances, how you can pick people up and take people away safely without parents gathering at the gates, and all of those things. And I just think it's going to be a very difficult time. And I hope that sense will prevail, and it'll be able to be done in a way that minimises the risks that people have. In terms of secondary schools, I think the idea is that those who have exams coming up next year ought to be given priority. And I think that that's what the head teachers of local Wallasey schools are trying to do. But I think that it's all very, very indistinct. Okay, I think now, is Brian on the call? Do we know? I thought I had another question. Yeah, Brian Kenny. I'm just going to read a question, Brian, that you sent in. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, the government said that they would do whatever it takes to deal with it. But it now appears that local government are expected to make up millions of pounds to pay for it rather than get support from the government. As a local councillor, I believe this is unfair. Do you agree? And what is being done to address this situation? Well, Brian, I couldn't agree more with your analysis of what's going on. I think that right at the beginning, when the lockdown began, the government said that they'd do whatever it takes for local authorities to be able to reorganise themselves so that they could deal with the crisis that the pandemic was throwing up, help, for example, those who are shielding, ensure that there's a humanitarian issue so people could be brought off the streets if they were homeless, people who are shielding could be properly supported, and that the local authority could keep key workers and key functions going so that whilst people were shielding from the disease, they were also a conduit for the economic support that the Chancellor of the Exchequer made available, particularly to small businesses, to try to keep the economy from drastic damage during the lockdown. The local authority, I think Wirral, has done magnificent work over the last 2 months in ensuring that our society has been able to carry on and that basic structures and systems have worked, that there's been help forthcoming in terms of food parcel deliveries, in terms of getting the homeless off the streets, in terms of giving out £43 million of support to local businesses so that they don't go under. And I know they've worked very closely with the Chamber of Commerce to do all of that. But the thing that struck me very much is that our local authority and also the Resilience Forum, they've taken to having to watch the national press conferences and then have planning meetings after, because they're given no advance notice of any of the government's announcements. So the announcement that, for example, you could you could go out and visit parks, or that golf clubs would reopen, that Boris Johnson made. Nobody was given any kind of advance notice that those things would actually happen ahead of them being announced nationally. And that puts a lot of local authorities in an impossible position. So our local authority, I think, Brian, has now got a £42 million funding gap on the Wirral between what it thinks it's going to spend if this period of lockdown or semi-lockdown lasts for another 3 months on top of the time that it's been in place so far. And they did that spending assuming that they would be supported by the government in doing so. And the first tranche of spending came 11.5 million Wirral got for supporting people during the coronavirus pandemic. But the second tranche was actually distributed in a very different way. And so that instead of distributing it with respect to the levels of poverty and deprivation in an area, they decided to distribute it per head. And so that meant that we lost 25% of the second tranche of money that we would have had if it had been distributed fairly. And yet our infection rates and our death rates, our mortality rates are higher than the English average. And not only because we've got more older people in the Wirral, but also because we've got more illness from being an area where we used to have shipbuilding, for example, more COPD, more people who are more vulnerable to the respiratory attacks that COVID-19 delivers. And yet there's this gap. So I do think it's massively unfair. We are all campaigning to try to get fair funding, but if somebody could get Brian in, he could ask a follow-up. Brian.
Hey, yeah, Thanks for that, Angela. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, yeah.
Okay,
You sound
yeah.
like you're in a wind tunnel, but we can hear
Oh,
you.
do I? Oh, got my headphones on. But okay. Anyway, thanks very much for your response. I think when this coronavirus broke out, and both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor said they would do whatever it takes to deal with it, I don't think they actually said they would expect local governments to pick up the bill. And I think we all know about the savage and cruel cuts to local governments over the last 10 years, where many councils, including Tory councils in Northampton, have gone bust because of the cuts they've had to face. Now, I know the Local Government Association, and more locally, Steve Rotherham, has recently sent a very strong letter to the Prime Minister on behalf of all the councils within the city region, basically saying that local governments can't afford, because of the savage cuts we've had over the last 10 years, can't afford to pick up the bill for this. And I just want to add my thanks to everything that Whittle Council has done over the last few weeks. As a local councillor, I'm very proud of the role that the local council has played. But at the end of the day, it's not right, it's not fair that councils like Whittle should be expected to pick up the financial tab when we haven't got the money in the first place. And I understand, Angela, you're in a very difficult position. We're in opposition. But I just ask you to do whatever you can from now on to ensure that we do get a fairer system of paying the cost of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I mean, obviously, I'm right there with you in terms of the analysis, and Steve Rotherham, who's put this case up to the government nationally, is absolutely right as well. And we're all, I think we've had the equivalent of cuts per head in spending since 2010 of £291 per head, which when you add it all up is a hell of a lot. The average for England is 188, and yet we have far more in terms of need, because we've got a more elderly population, and some of our population's very poor indeed, which puts more pressure on us rather than less. But this is an issue that the government has been well aware of since 2010 and has continued that austerity principle all the way through, and those that are the neediest have suffered more. And what we've seen from what's been going on with the differential effect of illness and death in this particular pandemic is actually that it affects those who are more vulnerable and weaker or poorer more. We know that there's an increased death rate for BAME people. We know obviously the older you are, the more likely you are to have serious illness from this, and there are certain health conditions that make you particularly prone to a bad result as well. Anything to do with respiratory issues, because it's essentially a kind of SARS-style respiratory disease, makes it worse. And of course, we've got higher levels of all of those things in our area, which means when you analyse the mortality rates and the infection rates, they are higher in Merseyside than the average in England, and our outcomes, obviously, if you look at them from other countries, in England and in the UK, are far worse than they are in any other European country. There's just been an analysis done which appeared in the Financial Times, which demonstrated that our death rate per million of population is the highest in the world. An atrocious thing to have achieved by this government. Right now, there's we've just got a little bit of time, I think, for one last question. Wendy Smith, are you on the call? You from Morton West. You asked a question. What has to happen for us as an angered and exhausted constituency to oust the Tories from power? How do we end this arrogant, elitist and disrespectful grip of the Tory government? I mean, that is the $64,000 question for all of us as Labour Party members. And I think the first thing to say is that the difficulty is we've only just had a general election, and in principle there doesn't have to be another election for 5 years. So that is part of the difficulty. We're just at the very beginning of the Parliament rather than the end. But I do think that the government's performance in the last 2 months, being behind the curve, not being serious, being flippant, and not being able to use the power of the state to deliver in a timely manner because you've weakened it so much. If you want to call it arrogant and elitist, I think you put it quite well. The one law for them and a different law for everybody else approach to politics that they have, I think will have imprinted itself on the memory of quite a lot of people now. And I think that is what we need to keep hammering away at. It's not in anyone's interest to maintain a government that is this incoherent and arrogant. So Wendy, if you're in, can we get a follow-up from Wendy? Is Wendy in the...
There's no Wendy, she submitted it by email.
Oh, she submitted it by email, okay. All right, so I think we've got time then for another one, and there's one here from Irene in Seacombe. What's happening in Wallasey about schools allowing more children to attend than key workers and vulnerable children, and what is Labour's position? Well, in that instance, we mentioned this a little bit. I think that what seems to be happening is that the government seem to have a series of dates in mind rather than looking at the objective approach of where the reproduction rate of the virus is and whether there's a chance of having a second spike. And so they decided, Gavin Williamson decided that primary schools had to reopen from the 1st of June. It made those announcements, as I said earlier, without any kind of discussion. And they're proceeding that way now. The Rebecca Long Bailey, who's our front bench education spokesperson, I think quite rightly, basically said that we can't just think, oh, we've got to get everybody back by a set date. We have to check whether it's safe. The TUC and the unions, the teaching unions, similarly have said the same thing. Nobody is against schools returning, and everybody knows how difficult it is, especially for those from poorer areas, if they can't go to school. We know, for example, that the well, let's take an example. Caldy Grammar School has 3% of people on free school meals. Mosslands has 47% of people on free school meals. And it's going to damage the education of those who don't have their own laptops, who can't access very easily lessons from afar if they don't get teaching. And so it's important to get back, but it also has to be done in a way that's safe for pupils and their parents, and safe for the teachers as well. Otherwise, you risk reseeding the virus back into the community. So I think that our approach is we want to see people back, and we want to see pupils back, and we want to try to ensure that education damages caused by the lockdown is as small as possible. But at the same time, it's the case that has to be done safety first, and so far the government haven't really shown much interest in ensuring safety. What they've just done is say this has got to happen, and they don't really seem to care very much about whether it's safe or not, and we think that that is an irresponsible attitude. So finally, I wanted to just thank you, because we're coming up to nearly 1 o'clock. I think that we haven't talked in detail about Dominic Cummings, but I think having helped to win then the general election with his way of sort of telling untruths on the sides of buses and doing sort of propaganda, which is very effective. He has now done the opposite. He's demonstrated that Boris Johnson relies on his advisor and can't do without him. He's demonstrated in no uncertain terms, in a very crass way, that we're run by a government that thinks that the rules are only for little people, that the rules don't apply to them, that everyone should do as they say and not as they do. And I think contemplating the fallout from the revelations that Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules when he went north and went on day trips to Barnard Castle and various other things, he's demonstrated that in a way which many, many people who've sacrificed a great deal during the lockdown will never forget. And I think that's toxic for them. I think if you look at the 9% fall in 4 days in the Conservative Party's position in the polls, and you look at the collapse of Boris Johnson's position in the polls, down from a positive poll rating of plus 19 to -1 in a few days, you'll see just how toxic the impression that they've given really is. And I think we've got to carry on being there for our local communities, carry on defending and recognising the fantastic work that our local authorities, that our public services and our councillors and the local authorities themselves have been doing to keep us safe in this area, and make the case over and over again that as we approach this huge recession that's coming up, we've got to make the arguments for having both a more socially and environmentally balanced economy, which demonstrates to people that we put them first rather than put finance first, and that we can rebuild a far better community than the one that the Conservatives have left us with. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining, and we'll see whether we can send this round, and we'll certainly see if we can do this again. Please let us know what you thought. Also let us know if you think that there'd be a better time of day or week that would be more convenient for you to do these kinds of meetings, and we'll see how we can go forwards. Look forward to the time when I can meet all of you again in person, rather than this in rather impersonal way. But thank you for giving up your time, and stay safe.